formal smiles, polite tone, coffee poured neatly into cups. Behind the facade, protocols, control, KPIs. She believed she had created the perfect order: daily reports, penalties for emotions, word limits, even a schedule broken down by the minute. Precision, regulations, counterfeit care, all designed for one purpose: total control. But in that system, she forgot to account for the most important variable: who was sitting across from her. When he signed her rules, it wasn't surrender. He began playing by her method, only better: cold, precise, flawless. And soon, her perfect project began to crack. She had built a machine of submission, and he became the mirror that reflected every inch of her manipulation. What started as a relationship rescue plan turned into a corporate liquidation. Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you stopped by my channel. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends or family. It really helps my channel a lot. Please tell me in which city or country you watched this video. I value every one of your comments. So, let's get started. Everything changed last Thursday evening. I stepped into the house and instantly froze. There she was, my wife, sitting stiff-backed at the dining room table, which looked less like a place for dinner and more like a makeshift corporate war room. Papers were fanned out beside charts, and her laptop screen displayed a PowerPoint titled Relationship Performance Assessment. Her gaze lifted to meet mine, wearing the exact expression of someone about to deliver news of departmental layoffs. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her as though I were an applicant at a job interview I hadn't applied for. I took the seat, curious rather than worried, assuming this was just another of her grand schemes. She had a flair for the dramatic, but this had the hallmarks of a long-planned presentation. With not a second wasted, she began reading from handwritten cue cards. "Following a comprehensive analysis," she announced, "I've determined that our marriage requires immediate remedial measures. You're officially on relationship probation, effective now." I blinked and leaned back, trying to absorb what I'd just heard. Relationship probation? Was that even a thing? She didn't blink, just calmly flipped a page in her tabbed binder. "It is," she said, without me having to ask. She spoke with the polished cadence of someone delivering quarterly financials. "Over the last several months, I've tracked multiple ongoing behavioral failures. Conventional methods of communication have proven ineffective. Therefore, we are initiating a structured 90-day performance improvement plan." I stared, dumbfounded. My wife of 6 years was conducting a corporate-style performance review of our marriage. There were literal spreadsheets and graphs illustrating my so-called marital inefficiencies, neatly color-coded and fully annotated. "Performance deficiencies?" I repeated, keeping my tone even though my mind was spinning. She proceeded with the confidence of someone presenting to the board. "Consistent tardiness with no heads-up, minimal engagement in household planning, poor attitude at social events involving my friends, and a consistent trend of putting your needs ahead of shared responsibilities." Each item was delivered with the precision of a seasoned analyst. She had evidence, timestamps, verbatim quotes, detailed logs. By her metrics, I was underperforming in very measurable ways. "Throughout this probation, we'll conduct regular progress checks, monitor compliance, and establish clear behavioral benchmarks," she said, sliding a stapled packet across the table toward me. "Whether this partnership continues or shifts to alternative outcomes will depend entirely on your results." I picked it up. 12 pages. 12 exhaustive pages, outlining expectations, conduct standards, and a scoring system for marital performance. She had effectively drafted a user guide for how I should function as a husband. "Alternative outcomes?" I echoed, flipping through the contents in disbelief. "If you fail to meet expectations," she stated without a hint of emotion, "we'll move forward with a separation. Nothing personal. It's a strategic recalibration." She delivered the words like someone rebranding a product, not ending a marriage. The whole presentation was so meticulously engineered, I almost had to admire the effort, even as it unnerved me deeply. She had transformed our relationship into a formalized assessment, complete with KPIs and termination clauses. I placed the document back on the table and studied her. She was utterly serious. This wasn't melodrama or performative. She genuinely believed she had the authority to place her husband under performance review. "How long have you been working on this?" I asked. "Roughly 3 weeks," she said, clearly proud of herself. I wanted the process to be fair and data-driven. 3 weeks. She'd spent nearly a month assembling this elaborate audit mechanism, one that treated me as an underperforming asset in need of restructuring. The sheer level of calculation was stunning. I rose slowly, taking in the visual tableau she'd curated: behavior metrics, emotional response graphs, a roadmap for how I was to evolve into a more acceptable spouse. "This is extensive," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You've covered every angle." Her face lit up. "I thought you'd respect the systems approach. We can begin first thing tomorrow." I nodded, already dissecting the implications. She hadn't just revealed her expectations. She'd shown her hand, her strategy, her desire for control. "I'll need tonight to fully review these materials," I said, lifting the binder. "They deserve a thorough read." She seemed pleased, confident that she now had the upper hand. But what she didn't realize was that in laying out her entire system, she'd also given me the tools to dismantle it. As I carried the so-called improvement plan upstairs, I was already developing my counter-move. If she wanted to treat our marriage like a business, I'd show her how executive operations really worked. The next morning, she was already in the kitchen, waiting, every bit the onboarding specialist. A fresh cup of coffee sat beside what looked like a relationship welcome kit. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, like this was all perfectly routine. "I've prepared your daily task list and a monitoring log." I poured myself some coffee and sat across from her, eyeing the next phase of her managerial scheme. Inside the folder were outlined responsibilities, self-assessment forms, and something she called the Partnership Success Metrics Dashboard. "Your check-in is scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp," she pointed out, tapping the itinerary. "No deviations allowed. I expect a complete summary of your day, interactions, time allocation, everything." She handed me a document that looked less like a tool for improving a relationship and more like a parole officer's checklist, complete with sections for daily routines, emotional monitoring, and, oddly enough, a self-assessed contribution rating to the partnership on a scale from 1 to 10. "There's also a purchasing protocol," she noted, flipping a page with practiced efficiency. "Anything over $50 requires prior approval. I made a convenient request form you can email me." I blinked at the paperwork in disbelief. She had effectively built a formal requisition system to access my own money, complete with explanation fields and an approval hierarchy. "Guidelines for communication are detailed on page 7, she added, clearly thriving in her newfound role as chief operating officer of our marriage. This section outlined strict response deadlines for texts and calls, specified acceptable conversation topics, and set minimum standards for engagement quality. I had exactly 15 minutes to respond to any message from her, no exceptions. Missing the window triggered penalties. "Here's how the point system functions," she continued, producing a laminated chart like a manager about to onboard a new hire. Good behavior earned credits. Mistakes deducted them. At the end of the week, the total determined which privileges I retained within the relationship. Yes, privileges. Even minor decisions, what movie we'd watch, where we'd eat, or whether I could go out with friends, were now considered conditional rewards, dependent on performance. "And what happens if I don't agree to this arrangement?" I asked, more curious than confrontational. Her face hardened. "Non-compliance results in immediate termination of the relationship. There's no room for negotiation." The sheer boldness stunned me. She had unilaterally redesigned our marriage into a performance-managed enterprise, and opting out wasn't a choice. I've also planned weekly evaluations, she added, holding up a calendar. Several Sundays were marked in aggressive red blocks. Every Sunday at 10 a.m., she would conduct a progress review to analyze my conduct, point out shortcomings, and establish fresh objectives. 2 hours every week had already been earmarked for this ritual, scheduled throughout an initial 90-day trial period. If you have questions, she said, please submit them in writing. But read the FAQ first. I spent considerable time on it. Yes, she had created a full-blown FAQ, 23 pages long, anticipating every conceivable concern, each one met with a scripted response. One last item, she said, retrieving what appeared to be a formal contract. I need your signature to confirm you've received the materials and agree to the framework. She expected me to formally sign off on a system that treated me like an employee under managerial supervision, in my own marriage. The agreement outlined key performance indicators, disciplinary actions, and exit clauses. I read every clause while she waited nearby, confident in her creation. She had accounted for every possible deviation: lack of enthusiasm, inappropriate tone, communication infractions, and even a section ominously labeled relationship attitude violations. This is remarkably thorough, I said, placing the document on the table and signing it. You've considered every variable. Her face lit up. I just want everything to be clear and efficient. Structure is the foundation of success. I looked at the stack of forms, scorecards, and monitoring sheets, an entire ecosystem engineered to regulate my every move in the relationship. She had turned our marriage into a corporate governance model with herself as the sole executive authority. I'm genuinely impressed by your level of detail, I said sincerely. You must have spent a serious amount of time on this. 3 weeks straight, she confirmed with pride. But a relationship is like anything else. It needs planning, commitment, and structure. She stood there beaming, completely unaware of what she had actually revealed. What she'd crafted wasn't just a system. It was a psychological blueprint of her need to control, laid bare through meticulous documentation. I'll need some time to fully process this, I said, gathering the materials. It's a lot. She nodded, pleased with my cooperation. Take the time you need. Then, without missing a beat, she added, just remember, the program begins today. Your first daily report is due at 6 p.m. I nodded, turned, and walked upstairs, carrying the weight of her management initiative. What she had handed me wasn't just paperwork. It was a transparent map of her fixation with dominance, dressed up as structure and discipline. I laid everything out on my desk and examined the elaborate trap she'd so confidently built. What she hadn't accounted for was this. She had just handed her entire framework to someone who understands systems better than she does. When Monday rolled around, I executed her plan with the kind of exactitude typically reserved for Fortune 500 audits. At 5:58 p.m. sharp, I stood outside our living room, now apparently functioning as her operations center, and knocked. She opened the door, visibly surprised. Good evening, I said coolly, handing over my completed report. I'm here for the scheduled check-in. She took the form, scanning it. Her initial satisfaction began to shift toward puzzlement. You logged your whole day in 15-minute intervals? The form asked for a detailed activity report, I replied evenly. I assumed that meant a full breakdown. My submission included time-stamped entries for every action. 06:47 a.m., brushed teeth for exactly 3 minutes. 7:12 a.m., breakfast completed. Estimated intake, approximately 420 calories. 8:15 a.m., departed for the office. Optimized my route to reduce commute time by 4 minutes. This is extremely granular, she said, clearly caught off guard by the level of detail. I've also compiled supplementary documentation, I responded, handing her a meticulously curated folder. Inside, categorized receipts, GPS tracking logs, and a detailed analysis of my productivity metrics. I approached her request with the precision of a forensic audit. "You actually log your conversations?" she asked, thumbing through the pages. I nodded. Section C requires comprehensive records of interpersonal exchanges. I've cataloged them by length, individuals involved, and alignment with our relational benchmarks. Even a brief chat with the barista was logged, classified as transactional, minimal emotional value, but consistently pleasant in tone. She flipped to my personal evaluation sheet and paused. "You gave yourself a 7.3 for today's relationship contribution?" I handed her a color-coded scoring rubric. "I completed 73% of the recommended bonding activities. The decimal reflects partial credit for unfinished evening tasks, delayed due to this evaluation meeting." Her face changed. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. Rather than resistance, she encountered execution at scale. "I've also outlined proposals to refine the system," I said, producing another document. This one focused on process upgrades. The proposals outlined automated data entry, standardized interaction forms, and live dashboards to track engagement metrics in real time. In effect, I had designed a software suite to optimize her emotional oversight system. "You're planning to automate all this?" she asked, skimming the interface mock-ups. "Manual input leads to inefficiencies and potential errors," I explained. I had also designed a prototype app, complete with alerts, intelligent reminders, and a scoring algorithm. She closed the folder, visibly stunned. "This is overwhelming." "Precision is the cornerstone of excellence," I said evenly. "My intention is to exceed expectations." By the next morning, I was ready with printed schedules outlining my goals for the day, prioritized by projected emotional significance. I'd created actionable steps for every planned interaction. "Good morning," I said, handing her a detailed morning agenda. "Our breakfast conversation has been slotted for maximum impact." The schedule broke our chat into time-bound blocks, each with specific objectives and desired outcomes. Casual breakfast talk had been converted into a performance-oriented discussion. "You planned out breakfast?" she asked, glancing at the document. "Spontaneous discussions often underperform," I replied. "Structure enables depth." I had even prepared a list of conversation prompts, sorted by emotional weight and likelihood of engagement. I analyzed the weather forecast for its potential to initiate meaningful discussion. By midweek, the system had become more robust. Triple redundancies in the documentation, backup copies for every report. Our marriage now ran like a tightly controlled organization. "You're really committing to this," she observed during our nightly check-in, paging through my latest submissions. "Total investment is non-negotiable," I answered. "Anything less diminishes results." I had begun wearing business casual attire around the house, clipboard always within reach. During official dialogues, I referred to her as program administrator. "Maybe we should ease up a little," she suggested, uncertain. "Lowering standards compromises data integrity," I countered. She was beginning to understand. Rigid adherence wasn't what she wanted. By following her framework without deviation, I was revealing its flaws in real time. By Thursday, she had stopped reviewing the daily reports. Still, I continued producing them. Even if unread, they were archived. A full week of rigorously tracked behavior. Then came Friday evening. She broke. "This is out of control," she said, holding my most recent file. "I don't understand," I responded calmly. "All metrics show optimal performance. Are you dissatisfied with my adherence?" Any critique now meant admitting the system itself was faulty. I hadn't broken any rules. I'd implemented them with such precision that the system's limitations were unmistakable. Saturday morning, I formally requested a meeting with the program administrator. She agreed, likely hoping to scale things back before the structure took over completely. "I've completed phase 1 of the compliance protocol," I said, setting down an even thicker folder. "I'd like to propose a new focus, shared accountability." Her confident expression wavered. "Shared accountability?" she repeated, unsure. I began by opening a folder on the table between us. Your model for evaluating performance is entirely unilateral, I began. But if we genuinely aim to improve this relationship, responsibility has to flow both ways. I had dedicated the past week to rigorously applying her own evaluation criteria to her behavior. Every conversation, every choice, the entire rhythm of our life together had been scrutinized through the lens she had insisted upon. Sliding the compiled report toward her, I waited. Her expression shifted as she flipped through its contents, charts, logs, statistics, all rooted in the rules she herself had created. You evaluated me? She asked, eyes darting across dense graphs and tables. I gave a silent nod. Fairness begins with consistent metrics, I told her. I hadn't tampered with her principles. I had merely enforced them across the board. The results were revealing. Using her self-authored benchmarks, her role in the relationship showed significant underperformance, chronic lateness with meals, minimal communication effort, emotional detachment, and a noticeable drop in expressions of gratitude. Her average partner rating, calculated against her own standards, landed at a troubling 4.2 out of 10. I directed her attention to a bar graph tracking her weekly scores, all falling short of the thresholds she had deemed acceptable. She stared at the data, her voice caught in hesitation. The metrics were undeniable, spawned from her own framework and used with exacting clarity. Your average message response time, I went on, pointing to a line graph, sits at 43 minutes, well above your self-imposed 15-minute standard. Some delays even exceed 2 hours. The very expectation she once championed had become an unforgiving mirror. I also logged your contributions to household tasks, I continued, opening a file labeled Domestic Participation Index. There's a consistent imbalance in the workload. This discrepancy demands immediate recalibration. Her rubric, applied neutrally, told a stark story. Her outputs lagged behind expectations. I'd even coined a term for it, managerial overhead inefficiency, to capture the pattern of delegation outweighing effort. This is ridiculous, she snapped. I refuse to be measured like this. I responded calmly, these aren't my rules. They're yours. And they had been applied equally, without partiality, to both of us. I'd even crafted a detailed performance enhancement strategy for her, featuring daily benchmarks and progress documentation. If she wanted to manage the relationship like a corporate entity, then she would experience every layer of that structure. Your social engagement metrics are especially concerning, I added, laying out event logs. You've shown low enthusiasm with my friends, minimal interaction at family functions, and disengagement from topics I care about. Every criticism she once directed at me now circled back in measured, itemized form. Her once authoritative framework had transformed into a verdict against her. To address the gaps, I've developed a 90-day corrective action plan, I said, revealing a binder marked Development Protocol. It's modeled after the one you gave me, only now it addresses your deficiencies, financial tracking, communication audits, and performance reviews. You can't do this to me, she shouted. I'm not the one who failed. I tapped the stack of documents. According to the data, the shortcomings are clearly outlined. Intervention is necessary. Her plan included weekly objectives, improving emotional tone, boosting social participation, and balancing domestic labor. What she had once demanded of me had come full circle. I also evaluated your leadership efficacy in this relationship, I said, presenting flowcharts showing unilateral decision-making. The evidence suggests poor collaborative governance. Her accountability structure had become a case study in its own failure. You've turned our relationship into a corporate performance review, she said, recoiling. This is madness. Not madness, I replied. Impartial execution of shared standards. She was boxed in by the logic she had established. To dispute the results meant discrediting her own system. To accept them meant submitting to its consequences. At last, she murmured, I need time to take this in. She looked shaken, forced to confront the reflection of her own methods. Take all the time you need, I said. But the joint probation protocol activates Monday. Your first daily report is due by 6 p.m. I had taken her management playbook and expanded it into a bilateral accountability structure. Her system, her expectations, I had merely enforced them without exception. These are your orientation documents, I added, handing her a packet identical to the one I once received. Please review thoroughly. Non-compliance isn't an option. She sat there in stunned silence, staring at the procedural machinery she had engineered, now turned against its creator. The trap she once laid for me had closed around her instead. Any questions about your improvement plan, I concluded, must be submitted in writing. I stood up, making it clear our conversation had concluded. Refer to the FAQ before repeating questions, I said with deliberate calm. I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out, leaving her encircled by an immaculate collection of her own failures, archived by her own standards, and organized within the very system she had always upheld. By Monday evening, precisely timed, as if syncing with a financial report, I returned. She'd clearly spent the weekend grappling with the new terms of engagement. Regardless of her evident inner turmoil, I maintained the professional distance she once prized. At exactly 6 p.m., I knocked on the door to what she had once named her leadership suite. Good evening, Administrator. I'm here for your preliminary compliance report, I stated. She looked up from the couch slowly, the orientation packet still gripped in her hands that had not moved for hours. I didn't complete it, she murmured. Non-compliance on day 1 is not a minor issue, I replied, checking a box on the clipboard that had become my constant companion. This infraction will be documented in your active performance file. The guest room had been transformed into a full-scale operations center, complete with labeled file drawers, behavioral trend charts, and procedural documentation. Since she insisted on treating our relationship like a business unit, I made sure she experienced what it felt like to be on the subordinate end of her beloved hierarchy. This is insane, she said, gesturing weakly at the piles of charts and documentation. Premature cessation would compromise data integrity, I replied, voice steady. Nonetheless, I'm open to strategic alternatives. A flicker of hope appeared in her expression, until I revealed a fresh folder. I've assembled a comprehensive audit of our relationship's performance, covering both probation periods, I informed her, holding out a dossier titled Partnership Evaluation, Full Scope Review. Inside were detailed records, timelines of our exchanges, observed behavior loops, and quantifiable input toward shared objectives. After an extensive longitudinal review, I began, reading from the summary, I've concluded that the relationship requires either a total structural overhaul or formal dissolution. She sat upright, a new alertness in her posture. For the first time, she realized this wasn't about minor adjustments. This was about dismantling the infrastructure entirely. The core issues are systemic and resist incremental reform, I continued, turning to a series of charts that mapped out the steady erosion of joint satisfaction. The data was conclusive. Increasing control measures, declining respect metrics, and a widening rift in foundational values. You adopted top-down strategies that conflict with mutual engagement, I said, pointing to a side-by-side model of collaborative versus authoritarian dynamics. She had constructed an empire under the label of relational reform. My findings laid bare its structural collapse. I'm formally placing this relationship under a 30-day review period, I announced, handing her a document that could have come straight from a human resources office. It outlined the scope of the inquiry, performance criteria, and possible outcomes. You can't distill our marriage into a performance review, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. You were the one who brought procedural accountability into our personal life, I reminded her. I'm merely implementing it with rigor. The criteria were exhaustive: trust metrics, mutual respect indicators, capacity for shared leadership, and forecasts of long-term viability. Every aspect of our relationship would be subjected to critical evaluation. I've also arranged individual development sessions, I said, offering her a printed calendar. These meetings will focus on your growth objectives, developmental trajectory, and expectations for co-leadership. Each session was designed like an exit interview, an opportunity to log intentions, assess alignment, and determine feasibility moving forward. Additionally, I'll be gathering external assessments, I continued, handing her a contact sheet. Feedback will be collected from close friends and professional associates to ensure a full-spectrum review. Her face went pale at the mention of outside opinions, but this was simply the next logical extension of her own methods, bringing in stakeholders for broader insight. In the event that continued collaboration proves counterproductive, I've drafted exit protocols, I added, sliding the final document across the table. It covered asset division, responsibility transitions, and disengagement logistics. I had turned what once might have been a breakup into a procedural handoff. "You're treating our separation like a corporate restructuring," she whispered. "Structured transitions reduce fallout," I responded. "Clear exit plans promote fairness and reduce ambiguity." I had accounted for everything, our shared resources, our roles, even our emotional debts, and designed a blueprint for controlled separation. She had always preached that efficient management demands foresight. I had only taken that lesson to its logical conclusion. "I don't want to lose this," she said quietly. "I just wanted you to grow." "You've redefined growth as erasing who I am," I answered, scanning my notes. "All available data indicates a fundamental incompatibility in our vision for partnership." She had been looking for someone compliant, an individual who would follow instructions without resistance. However, my file clearly indicated I was anything but submissive. "We can fix this," she pleaded. "We can return to what we had before." But it was that very version of before that had driven her to establish the probationary rules in the first place. I reminded her calmly, "You've already stated that conventional relationship roles aren't something you're comfortable with." The situation we were in now stemmed directly from her choices. The same exhaustive records she had once demanded were now undeniable evidence of her controlling tendencies and manipulative tactics. "Our first formal evaluation is set for Thursday at 7 p.m., I said, completing my preparations. "Please ensure you've reviewed the questions in Section 12 of the consultation documents." She said nothing, just sat there, silently holding the official notice, beginning to grasp that the system she had designed was no longer under her command. "The 30-day assessment period starts tomorrow," I added. "It would be smart to thoroughly examine the criteria. Whether or not this relationship continues will depend on your ability to demonstrate growth in compatibility." I handed her the comprehensive review documents and walked away, certain that the full scope of her misjudgment had dawned on her. Trying to impose corporate oversight on someone more adept with systems than she was had been her fatal misstep. A month later, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the same one where she'd originally outlined her probation plan. Now it served as the final audit site. I placed the finalized report between us and began reading my conclusions. Following a detailed analysis of all relevant data, I've reached a final decision regarding the viability of this partnership. Throughout the review period, she had worked frantically to show progress, submitting updates, trying to prove her value as a partner. The irony was painfully clear to both of us. "Your performance reflected some marginal improvements," I said, scanning the documents. "However, fundamental compatibility challenges remain unresolved." Every moment of the evaluation had been logged: the manipulative behaviors, the rejection of equitable roles, and her persistent belief that she deserved exceptions while I was held to impossible standards. "This relationship is officially concluded, effective immediately," I said, sliding a formal termination letter her way. She went pale as she read the words. I had mirrored the tone and structure of the original probation framework she had created, complete with justifications, timelines, and formal procedures. "You can't be serious," she murmured. But the evidence in front of her left no room for denial. This decision stems from a fundamental divergence in management philosophies and an irreconcilable approach to partnership, I explained, guiding her attention to specific sections of the report. I had assembled a meticulously researched case study that demonstrated how her methods of control had destroyed the trust, mutual respect, and shared decision-making required for any real partnership. The evidence was clear and delivered with clinical precision. I've also prepared a comprehensive exit plan, I continued, revealing a new folder. It details asset division, delegation of responsibilities, and a schedule for the transition. The plan was detailed, impartial, and thoroughly organized, covering everything from finances and belongings to logistical arrangements. She stared at the documents, clearly overwhelmed. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said, her voice quivering. We could still try therapy. But therapy demanded mutual responsibility, and her repeated refusal to acknowledge her role made that route implausible. "Your consistent deflection of accountability during this process significantly lowers the likelihood of success in counseling," I responded. That pattern had been recorded throughout the review. Every meaningful conversation had collapsed into denial, blame-shifting, or minimizing her role. "I've also drafted references for any future relationships," I said, offering her a sealed envelope. "It's standard to provide an honest performance overview." The reference was professional, but unflinching, outlining her leadership style, her need for dominance, and her difficulty working collaboratively in terms any competent evaluator would understand immediately. "This is insane," she sobbed. "You're treating our marriage like a company merger." "You're the one who structured it that way," I replied. "I just followed your model, diligently and professionally." It was her system that had led to this moment. Now she was witnessing her own experiment collapse under the weight of its logic. "I'll challenge this," she whispered, though her tone betrayed her doubt. "Every element of this process has been properly documented and adheres to legal standards," I said, presenting yet another folder. "Legal counsel has already been consulted, and the formal filing is underway." There were no gaps, no overlooked details, just a complete, lawful, and final resolution. No emotional appeal could change the outcome. "You're not the person I married," she said, clutching for some last emotional foothold. "This is exactly who I become when I'm treated like an employee instead of a partner," I said evenly. "You introduced a corporate model for our relationship. I just executed the plan. I had become what she had seemingly wanted, efficient, emotionally distant, and composed. But she had never understood that good managers, when facing persistent underperformance, rely on evidence, not emotion, to make their decisions. I've scheduled our final transition meeting for this Friday. All required documents and materials are now compiled and ready. During that meeting, we'll cover the precise details of how assets will be divided and solidify our protocols for communication during the separation period." She sat still, surrounded by the very system she had so carefully constructed, finally realizing that achieving her meticulously crafted design had come at the expense of everything that once held real value. I informed her, in the same neutral tone I'd use with a client, that she was welcome to leave her personal belongings at the house for now. For my part, I'll be relocating to temporary housing beginning tomorrow. I've already arranged an interim residence, established new bank accounts, and transferred the utilities, all carried out with the same strategic discipline she once championed as essential to our relationship structure. As I stood to go, I told her plainly, "Your attempt to engineer a relationship using corporate best practices succeeded. You got the structured, analytical, performance-oriented partnership you envisioned." She lifted her gaze, eyes brimming with tears, finally comprehending, far too late, that this so-called success had claimed everything of true emotional significance. "The difference," I concluded, "is that in business, no one wastes resources trying to salvage failing systems. They simply decommission them." I walked away from the table, leaving her alone with the dense paperwork that now served as the final documentation of her misguided corporate romance. She had demanded a hyper-regulated, metrics-driven relationship model, and that's exactly what I delivered. The irony was undeniable. Her insistence on executive-level control over emotional connection had led to a termination process so efficient, so definitive, it could be submitted for publication as a case study. Streamlined, final. Executed with professional detachment. She had treated our marriage like a management consulting project, and I had shown her the result when someone with real qualifications assumes command. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.